I used to think that the hardest part of being a man my age was the way the world slowly stops looking at you, but I was wrong. The hardest part is the moment you realize you've started looking at the world with eyes that are far too hungry for a lie. My name is Silas. I'm 68 years old, and after 40 years of restoring historic row houses in the cold, damp winters of Philadelphia, I thought I had finally earned the right to be fooled by a beautiful sunset and a smile that felt like a second chance. When I first rolled into San Miguel de Allende, I felt like I had finally stepped out of a black and white movie and into a world of saturated color. Back in Philly, my life was measured in the grain of old mahogany and the stubborn chill of Pennsylvania winters that seemed to settle deeper into my joints every passing year. I was a restoration carpenter by trade, a man who spent his life fixing the broken foundations of houses that were built long before I was born, and I suppose there's a certain irony in a man like that failing to see the cracks in his own judgment. My wife had passed 6 years prior, and my kids were grown, living their own busy lives in the suburbs, calling me on Sundays with that polite, hurried tone that tells you they love you but don't really know what to do with you anymore. I was tired of being a relic in my own city. I wanted warmth. I wanted to feel like my story wasn't just a long epilogue, and San Miguel seemed to promise exactly that. The air there smells like wood smoke and jasmine, and the light hits those ochre walls in a way that makes you feel like you're living inside a painting. For the first few months, I was content just to sit in the El Jardín, the main square, watching the world go by. I told myself I was happy with the solitude, but the truth is, I was a man waiting to be found. That's when I met Elena. She was 42, though she had a way of moving that made the gap between us feel like a minor detail rather than a chasm. She worked at a small gallery near the park, and the first time we spoke, it wasn't about the art. It was about the way I was looking at a hand-carved door across the street. I was tracing the joinery with my eyes, habits of a lifetime, and she walked up and asked me in perfect, melodic English if I could see the soul of the wood. It's an embarrassing thing to admit now, but in that moment I felt like she was the only person in years who had actually seen me. Not the old man with the sore knees, but the craftsman, the man who still had something to offer. We started taking coffee together, then dinners at the small spots where the tourists don't go. She told me about her family, her struggles as a single mother, and the dreams she had for a small boutique of her own. She listened to my stories about Philadelphia, about the time I spent 3 months hand-turning spindles for a Victorian staircase, and she looked at me with an intensity that I mistook for admiration. I felt a surge of energy I thought had died with my 50s. I started dressing better, I walked a little straighter, and I began to believe the dangerous narrative that I had stumbled into a late-life miracle. I didn't see the transaction beginning. I only saw a woman who seemed to find my presence as vital as I found hers. I was 68, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just waiting for the end of the day. I was waiting for her. The air in San Miguel has a way of softening your defenses, making the practicalities of the world feel like distant echoes from a life you've outgrown. By the fourth month, Elena and I were inseparable. She began inviting me to her home, a small, crowded apartment on the edge of the Centro where her mother and her teenage daughter live. It was a world away from the sterile, quiet house I had left behind in Philadelphia. There was noise, the smell of frying corn and chilies, and a sense of life that felt urgent and real. I felt like I was being folded into a family, a feeling I hadn't realized I was starving for until I was sitting at their small table drinking coffee while her mother nodded at me with a reserved but respectful smile. Elena started calling me her gringo corazón de madera, her gringo with a heart of wood, and she told me that my hands, scarred and calloused from decades of carpentry, were the most beautiful things she'd ever seen because they knew how to build things that lasted. When a woman tells a man my age that his history is an asset rather than a burden, he will do almost anything to keep her talking. The first shift happened so quietly I barely felt the ground move. We were walking past a storefront for rent, just a few blocks from the main square, and Elena stopped. She didn't ask for anything. She just sighed, a sound full of a tired, heavy kind of longing, and mentioned how hard it was to be a woman with a vision, but no capital in a town where the rent was dictated by the pockets of tourists. She spoke about her daughter's education, about the ceiling in her mother's room that leaked every time the summer rains turned the cobblestones into rivers, and how she felt like she was drowning just trying to keep their heads above water. I was a restoration carpenter. My entire identity was built on fixing things that were falling apart, I had a comfortable pension, a healthy 401k, and the proceeds from the sale of my Philly row house sitting in a high-yield account. To me, the amount she needed to fix that roof was a rounding error. To her, it was a miracle. I wrote the check that evening, telling myself it wasn't a gift for her, but a tribute to the hospitality her family had shown me. I felt like a provider again. I felt powerful. But once you open that door, the draft never really stops blowing. A few weeks later, the conversation turned to the boutique she had always dreamed of, a place to sell high-end local textiles and the kind of hand-carved furniture I could help her source or even build. She didn't suggest I pay for it. She suggested we invest in it together. It was a partnership, she said, a way for us to have a future that wasn't just dinners and walks, but a legacy. She talked about us as a unit, a we that I had stopped believing in years ago. I found myself at the bank more often, moving chunks of my life savings into a local account we shared. I told myself I was being a savvy businessman, but in the quiet hours of the night, when the adrenaline of her affection wore off, I knew I was buying insurance against being alone. I was paying for the privilege of seeing her eyes light up when I walked into the room, convinced that as long as I was the solution to her problems, I would never be the man she didn't need. I was 68 years old, and I was slowly dismantling my own security to build a house of cards in the sun. The business, which we named El Corazon de Madera, opened its doors on a Tuesday in late October, just as the jacaranda trees were beginning to drop their purple blossoms onto the cobblestones of San Miguel. I had spent the previous 2 months working harder than I had in a decade. My Philadelphia-bred bones ached from hauling reclaimed mesquite and hand-sanding tabletops in the dry, thin air of the highlands, but I wore the exhaustion like a badge of honor. I wasn't just Silas the retirer anymore, I was Silas the partner. Elena was a whirlwind of energy, curated textiles, and local PR, and for a while the shop felt like a monument to our shared future. But as the physical labor wound down and the daily operations took over, the air between us began to change. It wasn't a sudden frost, but rather a slow, pressurized thinning of the atmosphere. Elena was always at the shop, always on her phone with suppliers, or always too exhausted from the mental load of management to do more than offer me a distracted peck on the cheek before heading home to her mother's house. I started to notice a pattern in our conversations that felt less like a partnership and more like a series of status reports on my bank account. Every time I tried to talk about our relationship, about maybe finding a house for just the two of us, or taking a weekend trip to the coast, the conversation would veer with surgical precision toward a new emergency at the boutique. There was a tax issue she hadn't anticipated, or a shipment of walk-in rugs that required an immediate cash injection to clear customs. Whenever I hesitated, her demeanor would shift instantly. She wouldn't yell, she would simply withdraw. She'd become a ghost in the room, her eyes welling up as she talked about how she thought I believed in her, how she felt the weight of her family's survival on her shoulders, and how she supposed she was foolish to think a man like me truly understood the struggle of a Mexican woman trying to make something of herself. It was a masterclass in emotional leverage. She knew my greatest fear was being seen as the typical old American cold, transactional, and disconnected. So, to prove I wasn't that man, I kept reaching for my wallet. By the time I hit 69, the investments had crossed the six-figure mark. I was essentially funding a lifestyle and a business that I had no legal claim to, as everything was in her name, to simplify the local paperwork. I'd sit in the back of the shop, surrounded by the smell of the very wood I'd polished, watching her charm the wealthy tourists from Texas and California. She was radiant, professional, and entirely independent of me in those moments. I realized with a sickening jolt that I had become a silent, invisible foundation necessary to hold the structure up, but never intended to be seen or celebrated. I was the restoration carpenter who had fixed her life, and like the houses I used to work on in Philly, once the job was done and the walls were painted, the owner didn't really want the contractor hanging around the dinner table. I started to wonder if the second chance I thought I was living was actually just a very expensive, very beautiful performance, staged for an audience of one. The turning point came on a Tuesday evening in January, the kind of night where the high desert air turns sharp and unforgiving. I had walked down to the shop, thinking I'd surprise Elena with a bottle of wine to celebrate a particularly high sales month. Through the window of the boutique, I saw her, but she wasn't alone. She was sitting at the desk I had hand-built for her, laughing with a man closer to her own age, a local contractor she'd hired for some minor renovations I was too old to handle anymore. The way she leaned into his space, the effortless, unburdened light in her eyes, it was the exact version of her I thought I had bought with my devotion. I stood there on the darkened cobblestones, the cold seeping through my coat, and I realized that I wasn't her partner. I was her benefactor. I was the bridge she had used to get from a life of struggle to a life of status. And now that she had reached the other side, the bridge was just something she had to walk over to get where she was going. When I finally confronted her later that night at the apartment, the mask didn't just slip. It was set aside with a chilling, professional calm. I asked her where we stood, not the business, but us. I asked her when the investment would start feeling like a relationship again. She didn't cry this time. She sat across from me wrapped in a shawl I'd bought her in Merida and told me that I was being difficult and possessive. She said that my American mindset didn't understand the way things worked here, that my money was a gift of love, and that ask for an accounting of it now was an insult to everything we had built. She looked at me with a tired kind of pity and said, "Silas, you came here because you were lonely. I gave you a family. I gave you a purpose. You can't put a price on that." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me, and it felt like a serrated blade across the ribs. She was telling me that the affection had been the product, and I had been a satisfied customer until I started demanding the one thing she never intended to sell, her future. I spent the next month in a haze of legal consultations that led nowhere. Because I'd moved the money into accounts in her name, and because the business was registered as her sole property to avoid the gringo tax complications she had warned me about, I had no leverage. My investment was, in the eyes of Mexican law, a series of voluntary transfers. I realized then that the exit was going to cost me everything I had brought with me to Mexico. I wasn't just losing the money, I was losing the version of myself that was fixer and provider. I was 69 years old, sitting in a beautiful rental house I could no longer afford, realizing that I had spent 40 years building houses with solid foundations in Philadelphia, only to build my own retirement on a foundation of ego and wishful thinking. The shame was heavier than the financial loss. I couldn't even call my kids. How do you tell your son that you spent his inheritance on the feeling of being looked at by a woman who saw you as a walking ATM? I didn't stay to watch the grand opening of the boutique's second location. I sold what little I had left, the tools I'd brought from the States, my leather-bound journals, even the hand-turned mahogany bowls I'd made in those first few months of delusional bliss. I moved into a small, one-room studio on the dusty outskirts of town, far from the ochre walls and the jasmine-scented air of the Centro. From my window I don't see the parroquia. I see the scrub brush and the laundry lines of the people who actually work for a living. It's a quiet life, and a much poorer one. But there's a clarity in this silence that I couldn't afford when I was busy buying the noise of a crowded dinner table. I'm 69 now, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the difference between being needed and being loved. In my trade, when you restore a house, you're looking for the rot so you can cut it out. You're looking for the truth of the structure. But when it came to Elena, I was the one who painted over the rot. I wanted the second chance so badly that I became an accomplice in my own deception. I didn't just mistake her attention for love, I mistook my own bank account for a fountain of youth. I thought that by fixing her problems, I was making myself indispensable, forgetting that once a problem is solved, the solution is usually put back in the toolbox and shoved into a dark corner of the shed. I see men like me every day in the Jardine. I see them in their crisp linen shirts, walking a step behind women who move with the grace of those who have everything to gain and nothing to lose. I want to walk up to them, to grab them by the shoulders and tell them that loneliness is a far cheaper debt to pay than the one they are currently signing for. But I don't, because I know that at 68 I wouldn't have listened either. We don't come to Mexico to hear the truth. We come here to escape the truths we left behind in places like Philadelphia or Chicago. We come here to be the lead character in a story that should have ended 3 chapters ago. If you're watching this, and you're feeling that familiar ache of being unseen in your own life, I only ask that you look closely at the person who suddenly makes you feel like a king. Ask yourself if they love the man or if they love the stability the man provides. There is no shame in a transaction as long as you know you're in one. The tragedy is when you give away your soul thinking you're getting a hardened return, only to find out you were just paying the rent on someone else's dream. I'm starting over now, with nothing but my name and a few scars, but for the first time in years, the hands I look at in the morning belong entirely to me. And in this quiet, dusty room, that finally feels like enough.